Every offseason, it seems the Sacramento Kings fan base unanimously agrees there's one guy that the team absolutely has to go and sign. This offseason, that guy seems to be Naz Reid of the Minnesota Timberwolves. Yes, I do believe Reid would be a great signing for the Kings and could help the Kings. There also might be some redundancy with other guys that are on the roster or that may be on the roster when it comes to Naz Reid. But what kind of money would Naz ask for? What kind of role would he want in Sacramento? Is he even expected to leave the Timberwolves? Here to answer some of those questions and more is Ben Beecken, host of the Locked On Wolves podcast, right here on Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all offseason long. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I'm a Sacramento sports reporter and producer for ABC 10 News. Free agency is still a while off, right? It's going to be here before we know it. I mean, we're going to get into July and all of a sudden money's going to be thrown left and right. But here's the reality. Even though tampering is a thing and free agency doesn't begin until this certain date and this certain time, we all know, like, a report came out of Dame Lillard already recruiting, trying to get free agents to come join him in Portland. Like, we know it's all going on. Hell, it's going on before the season is even over amongst players who are playing against each other in the playoffs, for God's sake. Like, we know this is what happens. So it's really never too early to talk about free agency. And there are some decent free agent names that I think the Sacramento Kings should have on their radar. I listed a few of them earlier on in this offseason. And when we get closer to free agency actually beginning, I'll do a more dedicated pod specifically on free agency targets that I think the Kings should go out and get. This free agency class is not the most impressive at the top. Like, there's some decent names, James Harden, Chris Middleton, if he doesn't exercise his option, things like that. But this is not a stacked free agency class. But the good news is for the Sacramento Kings, they're not necessarily looking for it to be. I don't think it's a realistic idea that the Kings would land a tier or S tier marquee free agent. They don't necessarily financially have the ability to do that while they're also thinking about paying guys like Domantas Sabonis, Malik Monk, eventually Keegan Murray. So this might be a good free agency class for the Kings to find a player or two that could plug into the core that we believe is going to still be here and could help the team improve on the great season that they had last year. Naz Reid is definitely one of those guys on that list, no matter what. Like, Naz Reid could absolutely help the Sacramento Kings, brings a lot of what the Sacramento Kings would need, loves that energy, love that hustle. He and the Timberwolves really gave the Kings fits this past season. Like, for some reason, the Timberwolves probably were the worst matchup that the Sacramento Kings had. I think they're the only team to beat the Kings 3 times, if you don't count the Golden State Warriors. The Timberwolves really gave the Kings problems, and Naz Reid was a major reason for that. So it's only right that Kings fans have him on their roster. In fact, I don't know if Jerry would feel comfortable with me saying this, but I had a conversation with Jerry Reynolds. We had him in studio at ABC 10. He was one of our guests on our NBA Finals post-game show that we did after, I think it was game 2. And we were just talking off the record and just talking about whatever. And Jerry even mentioned, like, yeah, Naz Reid would be a guy I would love for the Kings to go out and sign. I would love to have on my team. So it's clear Naz Reid has value, and it's clear there's interest here in Sacramento, at least from fans and media members. Not sure about the organization. But we need a little more context. We need to know a little bit more about Naz Reid and maybe what his motivations are, what kind of money that he would demand, because he's been on an extremely team-friendly contract over the last handful of seasons. Ben will explain a little bit why that was, what he thinks Naz is going to go for, if he thinks teams will massively overpay and swing for Naz Reid as a starter, what his roles are and could be. So I really think you're going to enjoy this conversation. By the end of it, let me know. Do you want the Kings to go out and sign Naz Reid? Yes or no? If so, what would you offer him? And what would you tell him his role would be here in Sacramento? Be ready to share that. You can do so on Twitter at MattGeorgeSac. You can email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com. Or if you're watching on YouTube, you can answer those questions and leave your thoughts in the YouTube comment section down below. But for now, here is my conversation about Naz Reid from Locked On Wolves host Ben Beecken. Now that the Sacramento Kings have actually made the playoffs, Sacramento Kings fans are optimistic that free agency might be a little more open to them to add the pieces that they need to go from a good team to hopefully a great team. And one of the names that has been on the radar of Sacramento Kings fans is Naz Reid from the Minnesota Timberwolves. How long will he remain a Timberwolf? Are the Wolves interested in really bringing him back? And what kind of price will he command on the open market? To the best of our ability to answer those questions, I'm joined by Ben Beecken of the Locked On Timberwolves podcast to tell us a little bit more about Naz Reid. Ben, first off, my friend, welcome into Locked On Kings. I hope your offseason is going well for you.
So far, so good. I appreciate you having me. I will say off the top that in the past, when it comes to the Kings, it's always the Sacramento has been a franchise that at least for the last decade and a half, Wolves fans have been able to be like, well, at least there's the Kings. Like, we're not the only ones, but now I think the tables have turned and it's the Wolves. I mean, both teams are obviously a little more relevant now, but I can't say that anymore. Although I can still say that the last team the Wolves beat in the playoffs in a series was Sacramento in 2004. So there's that.
I was going to say the Kings-Wolves series back, and that series is always very special to me, not just because it was like young Kevin Garnett versus the Kings group, but I remember specifically during one of the Kings-Wolves games, I was at a baseball game at, it used to be Rayleigh Field here. It was the AAA ballpark of the River Cats. And they had a screen in left field that every few minutes would flash the score of the Kings-Wolves game. It was one of the games that was in Minnesota, and the crowd would either cheer or boo depending upon what came. So that series for some reason just has such great memories, even though the Kings ended up losing that series. But we'll get back there. Both teams will get back there eventually.
It has great memories for Wolves fans, but only because it's been 20 years since it still haven't won another playoff series. So that's the only good memories we have are that playoff series or that playoff run, I guess.
Well, the Kings are trying to get to the playoffs for the second straight year. The Wolves are going to be trying to get back to the playoffs. And it seems like if the Wolves are going to get to the playoffs, they would like to retain the services of Naz Reid, who seemed to be a really, really solid player for them this year. Just jumping right out of the gate, like first and foremost, your gut feeling or based off your understanding of the situation, are the Wolves going to be hungrily pursuing bringing Reid back, or do you think it might be curtains for his time in Minnesota?
The Wolves are saying all the right things. If in terms of retaining a player that they, I guess you could say as close as homegrown talent is a thing in the NBA, as much as that could be a thing. Naz Reid is that. He was an undrafted free agent 4 years ago by the Gerson Rosas regime, and it was just a fantastic find. Initially, it was just a summer league signee. He was going to be a two-way player. He was so good in summer league, they gave him a deal you would normally give a second rounder. So they gave him a 4-year partially guaranteed deal. And so there's a little bit of the emotional factor of like, hey, this guy's gotten better on our watch. We drafted him as, frankly, an out of shape, big with a lot of potential. And now he's gotten himself into shape and he's shown a lot that we'll talk about over the last couple of seasons, especially. The Wolves want to retain him. They've said that publicly during exit interviews, and Naz hasn't, obviously he can't come out and say, I want to be back for sure. Well, he could, but he hasn't really. But all the kind of undercurrents are that he really enjoys being in Minnesota. He's been around the facility. Last summer, he was there much of the offseason. The Wolves do want him back. It's just going to be, it's a straight salary cap crunch for the Wolves. And so that's where the question comes in. And we'll get a little bit into, I think, Naz's play and fit and everything. And I would also argue from a fit perspective, what's the right number for the Wolves? What should they be willing to pay to keep somebody that may not be a perfect fit, in my opinion, moving forward for the Wolves roster?
Well, that's the money question, I think is essential, because with every free agent, we have to ask about what their motivations are. Is it to win? Is it to get paid? And you look at Naz Reid and the deal that he signed, he's outperformed his contract. So I imagine he's going into the summer going, all right, I've busted my ass. Now it's time for me to kind of reap that reward a little bit. So do you have any kind of inkling that Naz Reid is financially motivated, or motivated by being maybe by his role, or by being on a contending team or a good team? Like, do you know any idea about what you think his motivations are?
I mean, that I would say the first two are the two biggest motivating factors, because like you said, I mean, he was on, yes, it was partially guaranteed money, but it was still, I think this year he made like roughly 3 million or 3.5, 3.8, maybe something like that. So it's not like he's made a ton of money so far in his career. This is his first big opportunity to get paid. And also from a role perspective, that's also what could push him out of Minnesota, right? Like if say the Wolves, to throw some numbers out there, say the Wolves offer him, 14 million and somebody else offers him 15 and a bigger role, that's a real decision to make because the Wolves, I don't know if you've heard, but they have a couple of all NBA centers. They happen to play the same position as Naz Reid. And so, Naz's maximum role, like this year, Karl-Anthony Towns missed 52 straight games and Naz still only averaged 18 minutes per game this year because he's best cast as kind of a small ball center. I mean, he is a center, but he's a little undersized. And he can play the 4 a little bit, but he was never a perfect fit next to either Gobert or Towns at the same time. And there were, like I said, the fit wasn't quite perfect. And so, to me, if you're Naz, you can get paid more and get more minutes on your next deal. And especially in the case of the Kings, who are a team that obviously finished better than the Wolves this year, you could get all 3. You could get the chance to win. You could get a bigger role. You could get paid. But I think that could ultimately be what sends him away from Minnesota is the combination of a little bit more of an annual value in terms of salary and then also a bigger role in terms of minutes.
With that role, you mentioned being a small ball center. Like I think some Kings fans initially envisioned a possibility of Naz Reid like being a starting 4 in Sacramento, moving Keegan over to the 3 as some sort of Harrison Barnes replacement. I've never really been a fan of that idea, although I think it's worth maybe discussing. But the idea is more as Naz Reid is a backup center for Domantas Sabonis. So then again, he's backing up another one of the best centers in the league. He's getting only a handful of minutes based off of when Sabonis isn't playing. But then the Kings also have a guy in Trey Lyles, who is a free agent, but someone who I'm very interested in the Kings bringing back, who also is capable of playing the small ball 4, who spaces the floor a little bit. I'm asking you, I don't know how familiar you are with Trey Lyles in that situation, but is that a little redundant, you think, to have a small ball 5 primary 4 in Trey Lyles that you want to bring back already in Sacramento? Let's say the Kings do bring him back and to bring over Naz Reid. Is that redundant to you, or do you think because Lyles is a floor spacer, it could work, I guess?
Yeah, I think it is a little redundant. And again, I mean, like, Trey Lyles much better than I do. I think Naz can space the floor. And like, what I've always said about Naz Reid on Locked On Wolves is that the idea of his skill set is always a little bit higher than what the production actually is. And I want to be really clear. Like, I'd love to have Naz back. I think he's easily one of the best backup bigs in the league. He's a fantastic third big to have on your team for a lot of reasons. But, everybody's like, oh, he can space the floor. Yeah, I mean, he can, but he's never been like a league average 3-point shooter, right? I guess he's 34% for his career, which is fine for a big, right? But the volume has kind of ticked up every year and the percentage hasn't. And so it's been just kind of like, he can stretch the floor, but is that really his best role? And he also which is, a similar percentage, I think, to Trey Lyles, at least in recent years. What else does he do offensively standpoint? Like, he's well-rounded in that he can do a little bit of everything, actually a lot like Karl-Anthony Towns in that respect, but he's not like he's a little bit of a jack of all trades, master of none offensively, but there's still a ceiling for him to get better in all those areas. And that's partly what makes him so attractive because he's got such a great skill set for a big. He's so nimble. He's got great touch on his passes and his shot and his shot, both in the paint and from the perimeter. He shoots just like this, almost like a rainbow set shot from 3. Such good touch. And there is a lot of potential there. But I would say that from what I know of Trey Lyles, I think there's a lot of similarities there, and they're similar size, I believe, and similar, shooting from the perimeter. Rebounding is another thing that, this was his best rebounding season from a percentage standpoint. I believe that's also one of those things with Trey Lyles that you'd like to see a little bit more out of him. I'd say the same with Naz. Like, if he's your 5 on the floor, you're going to be at a disadvantage on the glass, and that's why I think he's best cast as a small ball 5. He can play maybe, a quarter of his minutes at the 4 and you can get away with it. But there is some redundancy I would fear between Naz and Trey Lyles.
Today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the #1 way to play daily fantasy sports. Here's how it works. You pick 2 to 6 players and if they will go score more or less than their PrizePicks projection. So for the NBA, even though the NBA is now over for basketball, you do it for the WNBA too. Like, let's say the Kings were playing and they had projections for every single player, right? It's not just Fox and Sabonis, but let's say Fox was projected to score 23.5 points. Sabonis was projected to score 20.5 points and Keegan Murray 18.5 points. Well, let's say you take the over on all 3 of those and you get it right, you can win up to 25 times your money. No competing against other people, just you versus the projections available. Like I said, it's going on crazy right now for the WNBA, for the MLB, if you're interested in baseball and things like that. Of course, when basketball season returns for the NBA, there's a ton of action around that. NFL season, ton of action around that. They even have it for like European sports, combat sports, golf, things like that. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that easy. They offer safe and fast withdrawals, and currently it's operational in over 30 states and in Canada. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. Don't forget, enter that promo code Locked On and sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100 at PrizePicks. The Minnesota Timberwolves seem to have a lot of success against the Sacramento Kings this year. The Kings really struggled against Minnesota, and one of the reasons for that was the play of Naz Reid. Like, he really drew the attention of Kings fans, and with how effective he was and frustrating he was for the Kings at times to go against. But we only saw him a handful of times. You saw Naz Reid play every single night. How would you describe like Naz Reid, the best version of Naz Reid, and how often did that make an appearance for Minnesota?
I would say it was certainly, and this is a positive thing for his free agency candidacy, or pending free agency, is that when he saw more minutes, he came through. And there were a handful of games, even going back a couple of seasons, where he would just, Cat missed a game and he would drop a 22-9 or something like that. And it was just the problem early in his career was always more on the defensive end of the floor, and he's improved there. He's improved rebounding. So the ideal Naz game is if he's running the floor, he can pass on the move. He can dribble. He's got a great handle for a big. Ideally, you're playing him in a lot of pick and roll. He can both roll and pop. So I think pick and roll, he's a really good pick and roll big for that reason. And I think he pops more than he rolls. I'm pretty confident of that. And just from an activity level, just getting him involved in offense. Like and that's one of the reasons why I don't actually love his fit, at least not at a high dollar amount in the future of Minnesota. So when he's on the floor, he wants to be involved in your offense. And he can get hot from three, like a lot of guys can. He can be active on the offensive glass. He's a really good finisher inside. I think the most exciting thing about Naz Reid, though, in addition to like the ceiling that he has from like as a playmaker, like he hasn't done a ton of that, but I think he actually can be a bit of a playmaker if you put him in that position, like in the high post or something. When he faces up on the perimeter, he's a lot like Karl-Anthony Towns in that he can just get that first step past you, long strides, super athletic. Actually, he broke his wrist this year dunking over somebody or tried to dunk over somebody, because that's his mentality, is if he gets that first step, he's going to dunk on someone. And when he's in that zone, and he can do that, but if you play off, he has, a 34% chance of knocking down an open three. He's very, very dangerous offensively. And Wolves fans saw that, at times when Towns was out this season, when Gobert was in foul trouble, and some of those games when he played more minutes at the five. But he's so dynamic offensively that you got to put the ball in his hands and let him work. And he's so much fun to watch facing up from the perimeter. That to me is the best version of Naz Reid.
The Kings offensively had one of the best offenses the NBA has ever seen this past season. So offensively, they feel like they're pretty good. They would like to add on to it if they can. It's defensively that they're looking to grow, and a lot of that is going to be just asking more and asking their core players to be better. One or two guys coming in is not going to save or fix their defense. But Naz Reid defensively, like how do you describe what he brings consistently defensively?
That's his biggest shortcoming, but to be clear, he's really improved. In fact, most advanced metrics would suggest he was a slight net positive defensively this year, or at very least kind of like a net zero, like right around average. That's an area early in his career, he was out of shape when he came into the league. He didn't play a ton as a rookie or even into his second year. When his role started to increase, he still needed to kind of get into shape. You still don't really want him on the perimeter, stuck in isolation as you wouldn't with most bigs. But he can hold his own when he's switching on the perimeter. I think his best impact defensively is he best plays in drop pick and roll coverage. And I guess I don't know exactly what the Kings usually do in those situations, but the Wolves played a lot more drop this year because they had Rudy Gobert, and in previous years they switched a bunch and they did a lot of blitzing on the perimeter, played a lot of high wall pick and roll. And that didn't, like, Naz sometimes got a little bit lost there, but if he's now figured out from a from a X's and O's perspective, how to play in drop coverage, which he really struggled with early in his career. And he's remade his body. He's athletic, super athletic. He's very long. So he can play successfully in a drop coverage. He can get exposed a little if he, put on skates a little bit if he ends up on athletic fours, which is part of the reason why he's best cast, I think, as a center. He's not a traditional rim protector, but because of his length and athleticism, and I think what's an increasing kind of defensive IQ and understanding of team concepts, I think he's a pretty good help defender and a pretty good coming from the weak side to get blocks. That's improved quite a bit, but there's certainly room for growth there. I would say this year, though, they could plug him in defensively with the second unit. And the Wolves had a top 10 defense this year. Obviously, Rudy Gobert was a big part of that. Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels. But Naz did not hurt the Wolves on defense, which I wouldn't have been able to say after either of the 3 previous seasons. So it's certainly an area he's improving. And there is still some upside because of his athleticism and his length.
This is total gut feeling guesswork here, like we already touched on earlier. But if, let's say, the Kings and the Wolves offered the same amount of money, like you said 14 million earlier. So let's just say it's like 14 million per year, same amount of money, same length of contract, player option at the end, doesn't matter. Like it's the same exact contract financially for him. He either, or I guess the question is, do you think the Kings being projected to be a better team or finish higher in the standings, and his assumed role here in Sacramento would be enough to draw him or for him to choose Sacramento over Minnesota?
I think yes. Wolves fans aren't going to like that. I think if it comes down to the exact same contract, like you said, and he thinks that, the role is pitched to him in Sacramento as being greater than the role in Minnesota. He's always been a guy who's just chomping at the bit to play and produces when he plays, and he, could see him betting on himself and saying like, hey, I'll sign, it's probably a 3 or 4 year deal would be my guess. Like, hey, how old? I think he's only like 23. Yeah. He was 23, turns 24 later this summer. So like in 4 years, he's still in his prime at age 28. I bet he would take the same amount of money, say, I'll get a slightly bigger role in Sacramento. I'll bet on myself to, earn this contract and then some the next time I hit the market. I bet that that's the case. I think if all things are equal, it really does seem like he's happy in Minnesota, but I believe that he would look at this and be like, hey, Rudy Gobert's not going anywhere for 3 years. Karl-Anthony Towns, there's all sorts of Towns rumors, and I think that's kind of the wild card here is if Towns is actually traded. The Wolves likely are thinking they're bringing Naz Reid back. But if Cat's not traded this offseason, he's probably not getting traded next year when he's got $50 million on the books. So I think Naz could kind of play that out and say, like, if all things are equal, I'm going to have more opportunity over the next 3 to 4 years in Sacramento for the same amount of money. I'll go there, even if I enjoyed my time in Minnesota. I think that it really will be opportunity as maybe a tiebreaker here.
A handful of seasons ago, the Kings brought in Richaun Holmes on a really team-friendly deal, and he ended up taking Dwayne Dedmon's starting center spot and became the starting center for the Sacramento Kings for a handful of seasons until he got a decent payday because of that. Now, unfortunately, he's not playing, and he's one of the worst contracts in the league, but that result is more team-specific than it is, I think, indicative of Richaun Holmes specifically. The reason why I provide that context is, can you envision, or do you think it's a realistic scenario out there that there's a team, it might not be the Kings or the Wolves, but a team that looks at Naz Reid and says, if we bring him here, he can be a starter for us, or he will be a starter for us? Do you think he's got that kind of potential, or would that require maybe some desperation from that team to fill a roster spot?
I think he does have that potential. If I was the, president of basketball operations of random team X, I would be hesitant to commit more than, I threw out 14 million earlier. I wouldn't pay him that much because I think it's a small enough chance that he hits that potential because, again, he does everything well, but there's not really like one master skill that you can hang your hat on. It's like, will he improve everything? There's certainly a chance. He's going to be 23. And I always like to say on Locked On Wolves, all it takes is one. And as we've seen in NBA free agency so often, like all it takes is one team with cap space. And I don't have a great list in front of me right now, but a team with cap space that says, yeah, we think Naz could be an all-star in 2 years at age 25. Like, let's give him, 18 million a year, whatever that looks like. I absolutely think that's possible. I had Howard Beck on the show a couple of weeks ago, and the number he put out was he thought he could get 15 million. The Wolves, I don't think, can realistically offer him more than 12 unless they're willing to kind of not bring back Nickeil Alexander-Walker, not bring back, there's a couple other guys that Taurean Prince has an option. Like if they let Prince go and they say, we really believe in Naz and we might trade Cat, like they could maybe get to 14 million. I don't see any world that the Wolves go 15 million plus. You just can't sink that much cap space into essentially one position with a little bit of flexibility there, obviously. But it wouldn't surprise me if there was a team out there that said, we're going to give him more than everyone else, because there is that, like, everybody loves the idea of this ultra athletic big that can also step out and shoot threes. If we can just get him to play in a team concept defensively, he's a little bit positionless offensively because he can dribble and shoot. Teams like obviously Denver being a recent example of finding guys that could do those things. Naz could be a light version of that with a high ceiling. So yeah, I could absolutely see a team just kind of breaking the bank to sign Naz Reid.
You mentioned the rumors around Karl-Anthony Towns. I'm not asking this from the interest or belief that the Sacramento Kings would have any chance in hell of trading for Cat. I just don't think that's in the cards for the Kings. However, the reason why I bring it up, Ben, is because a lot of people, myself included, feel like the Timberwolves kind of broke the trade market with the package that they sent to Utah for Rudy Gobert. And I think we still see teams kind of recovering from what is the value of a first round pick or four of them. So the reason why I ask this, do you think the Wolves, if they're going to move on from Cat, are looking to recoup that value of, if Cat's being sent out, we're getting a decent player and 4 first rounders and getting a lot of our picks back? Or like, what do you think the trend in the market is for what the Timberwolves would even try to do if they're moving on from Karl-Anthony Towns?
I think they put themselves in a tough spot because of breaking the trade market for that exact reason, because you would think that a return for Cat would actually be something similar to what they got for Rudy, or what they traded for Rudy Gobert last year. But it'd be hard to argue that Gobert at age 29 last year with his contract would be worth that much more than Cat this year. Obviously 3-4 years younger. Now, of course, Rudy has a longer track record of being a superstar, all defensive player of the year a couple of times. Like, there's reasons why you could argue over who's the better player in a vacuum.
I think,
but
Cat's better. I think Cat's way better. I just think I would give more for Cat than I would for Rudy, and that is even going back to last year. So I think the Wolves should operate that way.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that may actually be one of the things that, like I said on the show, I think last week, that clearly Tim Connolly, the Timberwolves president of basketball operations, I think it's clear he made the Rudy trade last summer thinking genuinely that the too big thing could work. And we don't know that it won't, because Cat missed 52 games in a row last year with the calf injury. But I think he made the trade genuinely thinking it would work, but also knowing that he could pivot and trade Karl-Anthony Towns at some point and recoup a decent chunk of what he traded away. And Ant is the plan all along anyway. And so then, like, if you just look at Anthony Edwards and now Jaden McDaniels, who's about to get an extension and should have been on an all defensive team this year, plus you still have Rudy Gobert, that's still a pretty good core, plus whatever you get back for Cat. The problem is Cat only played in 29 regular season games and struggled in the playoffs, and his trade value is worse than what it was a year ago. What will it be a year from now before the Supermax kicks in? And so that's where it's such a weird, like, do you hang on to him to try and prove your trade correct and also hopefully win because he's a really good player? Or do you trade him, admit you might have been wrong, and understand that if something goes wrong this year, like say he gets hurt again, or you only win 45 games and then Cat's trade value takes a hit, he doesn't make the All-Star team or whatever, now you can't trade him at 50 million next year and get half of what you would have gotten. So they've put themselves in a bit of a tough spot, but there's still multiple options for what they can do. I still think it's most likely, I've said it's 75-25. I think they keep him. I'm just pulling that number out of thin air just based on what everything we're all hearing. I think it's likely he's still on the team in the fall, but there absolutely is a chance that if somebody comes along and says, hey, we'll give you most of what you traded for Rudy Gobert, the Wolves could just say, fine, we'll take the redo, and we'll just build around Ant.
Yeah, if we're going off gut feelings, I'm completely detached from the situation, but I would be personally surprised if Cat wasn't in a Minnesota Timberwolves jersey next year. But that kind of leads perfectly into my final question. I wanted to open this up for you here. I don't expect you to know a ton about the Sacramento Kings situation, but I think hearing outside perspective on your team or what your team is doing is really important. So I wanted to ask you just your takeaways or your thoughts on what the Sacramento Kings are doing. I don't know how much you watched the Kings Warriors series in the playoffs, but I mean, what the Wolves were a handful of seasons ago when they finally made the playoffs, and the mistakes that they made and what you learned from that second year after making the playoffs versus the Kings going into that second year. do you have any just thoughts or takeaways on the current state of the Sacramento Kings?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting case because the guys that broke through for the Kings are players that, I guess in the case of Sabonis, became a superstar after being a couple of other places. With Fox, it took a little bit longer, but in Sacramento, I think that's really interesting. Like it's different than obviously what the Wolves have done, and it still kind of has that, in my opinion, again, outside, and I guess Harrison Barnes being a big part of it. It's not like he was a homegrown player. Kevin Huerter, I guess, too. So, but I think it's exciting because they're young stars, but like all kind of had different paths to get to where they are. And obviously with the offense as good as it was, I'll be honest, and your listeners will not like me, but I didn't love De'Aaron Fox as a younger player. I didn't think he would become what he was this year. And, I wonder if there's a little bit of good fortune that came with some of the late game heroics that, like, is that going to happen all the time? But he's also the type of player that obviously can take over a game late. And there are guys who just have that skill set, have that athleticism and the mindset to be able to go and do that. So that, to me, with as good as the offense already is, and as good as De'Aaron Fox is at taking over late in games, like, I don't see this team like crashing backwards anytime soon. It's not like, other than, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like, other than, I guess, Harrison Barnes, like, there was no other key rotation piece that would be in or past or even in their prime. So like, there's a lot to look forward to in Sacramento. The Wolves, you could say the same with Ant, and the Cat situation is a little more tenuous, but you still don't know what's going to happen with Rudy. I think the Kings are in a decent position from a cap perspective, and are going to owe extensions, I guess, to Sabonis, or unextension to Sabonis. But like, I don't know. It seems really sustainable. Obviously, the West isn't getting any easier, but I think if you're the Kings, you just got to hope for continued progression for Fox, that doesn't get stale. Like we've seen, like, different players, obviously, but some similarities to like a Trae Young, who had a breakthrough season or two and then kind of backslid a little bit. And we've seen that with some other, DeJounte Murray, of course, also now ironically in Atlanta. Hopefully that's not the case for De'Aaron Fox, but I think if this team keeps doing what they did this year, I mean, it could be a 50-win team next year. I mean, the West, for as tough as it is, there was a lot of, as everyone was bunched up for so long this year. They certainly could break through even more next year, I think.
What went wrong in that one season after the Wolves made the playoffs that the Kings should be considering or should just outwardly want to avoid?
Do you mean, so the Wolves made the playoffs with Butler in 18 and then traded Jimmy Butler, and the next 2 years were not great. And then they made him last year as a 7 seed and took Memphis to 6 games. This year, lost, backed their way to the playoffs.
To me, it's the 18, because this year I could point to the Cat injury that's pretty much, and the Wolves were still knocking on the door. So I'm thinking and I was thinking about the Wolves return to the playoffs when Jimmy Butler was there.
Yeah.
And it was like, okay, now they're finally here. They broke that drought. They're sustainable. And then it fell apart so quickly. That's more what I'm thinking.
Gotcha. Yeah. And the obvious answer is they traded Jimmy Butler, but the rest of the team was basically still intact, right? Like, you still had Karl-Anthony Towns as your other star, if you will. I think part of it was Jimmy Butler kind of sabotaged the beginning of that season, and they were roughly 500 in mid-November when they traded him. So they got off to a bad start, and then there were just bad vibes. They were still right around 500 when they fired Tom Thibodeau, and it's interesting. They fired him. I think they beat the Knicks by like 20, and then they fired him right after the game. They were 19-21 at the time that season, and Karl-Anthony Towns still had a good year. Like, even after trading Jimmy Butler, you're still, I mean, Cat, that was probably his second best season. You still had, that was the trade. You got back Robert Covington that year. And I guess there wasn't a whole lot else besides Towns and those pieces that were part of the previous team, because this is obviously before Anthony Edwards. So I think that was more just Towns wasn't ready. And I think now we can say he probably never will be the guy on a championship team. Like, it's maybe unfair to say that, but I think there's kind of this sense that he can be your 1B or your second option and be a phenomenal scorer. But like, the defensive inconsistencies and just from a mentality standpoint, he get in foul trouble he's always in. Like, it's tough to hang your hat on him. I don't think he was 23 at the time, right? And they had tasted enough success in that they made the playoffs. Then the Jimmy Butler thing happens, and it just kind of crumbled around him. And there wasn't much else other than Tibbs screaming on the sideline and, a few role players like a Taj Gibson and a Gorgie Jang. Robert Covington. Towns himself wasn't enough to kind of pull that all together at age 23. I don't know that he is now either. And I don't know that anyone that's trading for him is going to say like, he's our guy, which is part of the reason why I really want them to run it back, because you have Ant. He can be your guy, even if Cat's still a better player in a vacuum right now than Anthony Edwards. And I truly believe that. Ant obviously has an astronomical ceiling. If he's the guy and Cat is the next guy, and you still have Rudy Gobert and you still have Jaden McDaniels, that's a pretty good setup. But I mean, to get back to answering your question, yeah, I mean, I think Cat, that was the biggest problem, is there wasn't a second star, and the infrastructure around him is not what, say, the Kings have now. Like, the Kings have multiple stars with Fox and Sabonis, and multiple exciting role players with upside, like a Keegan Murray or whoever else. So I do think there's a lot of differences between the 2018-19 Wolves and the current version of the Sacramento Kings.
Well, Ben, we'll see what happens with Naz Reid. Again, I don't think anything's going to happen involving the Kings and Karl-Anthony Towns, but everybody will be paying attention to what's going on over there. And hey, who knows? Maybe we'll get a Kings Timberwolves playoff series next season. Although I'll be honest with you, I would not feel great about that based off the success that the Wolves had against the Kings this year. They just seem to be a really tough matchup for Sacramento, but maybe the Kings can grow out of that. Bring on next season. That's all I'm saying. This offseason's already getting too long for me, Ben, but I appreciate you, my friend. Thank you so much for doing this and providing your context. Keep up the great work over there on Locked On Wolves.
Absolutely. Appreciate you having me.
Big thank you to Ben for joining me here on Locked On Kings. A real pleasure to talk to him and have him on. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Now we look forward to what the Kings actually do. If the Kings were to go out and sign Naz Reid, I think the Kings should absolutely be in the sweepstakes for Naz Reid if they don't get him, but bring back Trey Lyles. It's not a total loss. I am a little like, there is a good chance that if the Kings were to land Naz Reid, they would just let Trey Lyles walk. I hope that's not the scenario, because I want Trey Lyles back here in Sacramento. I would love to have both of them here in Sacramento, and then you have your backup 5 and backup 4, or you have them battle it out and you figure it out. Like, that's never a good or a bad problem to have. So I would love to see Naz Reid in a Kings uniform, of course, but I don't think the Kings are going to go too crazy, and other teams might. I mean, that's one of my major takeaways from this conversation with Ben. So again, let me know what you think about Naz. If you want the Kings to go out and get Naz, I appreciate that. Please continue to join me here on Locked On Kings for our future episodes. The draft gets closer and closer. So it's going to be busy. It's ramping up again, even though the NBA Finals just wrapped up. So welcome to the NBA offseason. It's only the offseason when you get to like August and early September. So we're going to enjoy the ride together. I appreciate your support as always. Can't wait to have you join me on the next episode of Locked On Kings. Until then, my name is Matt George. You have been listening to the Locked On Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.